Parents kicked me out on Christmas. Now they're trying to claim my company as a family business. The Christmas lights twinkled mockingly as I stood in the driveway, snowflakes settling on my shoulders, a duffel bag clutched in my frozen fingers. My father's final words echoed, "If you think you're so much better than us, then go prove it." Behind me, the Anderson family Christmas Eve dinner continued, without interruption. I could hear my sister Olivia's musical laughter, the clinking glasses, and my mother's practiced charm as she entertained guests. No one came after me. No one even noticed I was gone. My name is Alex Anderson, and I've spent my entire life being invisible in my own home. Alex, why can't you be more like your sister? Was the soundtrack of my childhood. While Olivia danced and dazzled, I built and created. While she collected admirers, I collected ideas. My parents never saw the value in my quiet determination, my analytical mind, or my entrepreneurial dreams. That morning had started like many Christmas Eves before it. I'd woken early, excited to share my business proposal with my family. After 6 months of research and meticulous planning, I'd created a blueprint for a tech startup that could revolutionize supply chain management for small businesses. "Mom, Dad, I've been working on something big," I announced at breakfast, my portfolio clutched tightly. "I've developed this software that can help small business owners track inventory and—" "Not now, Alex," my mother interrupted, barely glancing up from her phone. "We need to prepare for the party tonight. Olivia's bringing Richard Hartwell, the son of Hartwell Industries." My father nodded approvingly. "Smart girl, making connections that matter. That's how real business is done." "But that's what I want to talk about, business," I persisted. "If I could just show you my projections." Olivia swept into the room, her perfect blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. At 28, just 3 years older than me, she'd already mastered the art of commanding attention without effort. "Daddy, I need the credit card. The caterers want an additional deposit," she said, kissing our father's cheek. He handed it over without question. "Alex was just trying to show us some business idea," my mother said dismissively. "Something about inventory." Olivia's eyebrow raised. "Oh, are you still playing entrepreneur, little sibling? How cute." She patted my head like I was a child. "Some of us are working on real business deals, not fantasy projects." I bit back a retort. What real business had Olivia ever done besides spending our parents' money and taking credit for other people's work, including mine? 3 years ago, I developed a marketing strategy for our father's construction company that increased revenue by 40%. Olivia had presented it as her own, and my parents had praised her business acumen for weeks. When I tried to speak up, my father had shut me down. "Don't be jealous, Alex. Olivia just understands our clientele better than you do." The party that evening was the final straw. I'd put on my best outfit, a modest but professional ensemble that had cost me 3 months of saving from my part-time job. Olivia, draped in designer clothes our parents had funded, was holding court in the living room. "Alex," she called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was just telling Richard about my brilliant little sibling, always tinkering with computers and silly apps." "Actually," I said, finding a rare moment of courage, "I've developed a comprehensive business model for—" "Oh, Alex," my mother laughed, cutting me off. "No one wants to hear about your little hobby tonight. This is a celebration." "It's not a hobby," I insisted, my voice stronger than usual. "I've spent months developing this concept. It could revolutionize how small businesses—" "Enough," my father interjected sharply. "This is neither the time nor the place for your fantasies." Something snapped inside me. Years of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated crystallized into absolute clarity. "When is the time, then?" I demanded, my voice rising. "When will you ever take me seriously?" The room fell silent. My father's face darkened with anger. My mother looked mortified. Olivia smirked. "I have ideas. Real, valuable ideas," I continued. "But you've never once given me the chance to prove myself. You've handed everything to Olivia, even the things I created. 3 years ago, that marketing strategy that saved your company, that was mine, not Olivia's." She stole it, and you didn't even question it, because she's your precious golden child." Gasps echoed around the room. Olivia's smirk vanished, replaced by fury. "How dare you?" my mother hissed. "Apologize to your sister immediately." I looked from face to face, my father's rage, my mother's embarrassment, Olivia's calculated anger, and realized that nothing would ever change. "No," I said simply. "I won't apologize for telling the truth." My father stood, towering over me. "Then get out," he growled. "If you think you're so brilliant, so much better than this family, then go. Prove it without our name, our connections, our money." I did something that shocked even myself. I walked calmly to my room, packed a single bag with essentials, grabbed my laptop containing all my work, and walked back downstairs. The party had awkwardly resumed. My father stood by the fireplace drinking scotch as if nothing had happened. My mother was directing caterers, her social mask firmly in place. Olivia caught my eye as I headed for the door. For a split second, I thought I saw regret flicker across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by cool indifference. "You'll be back," she said softly. "You're nothing without this family." I paused at the door, the weight of 25 years of invisibility lifting from my shoulders. "You're wrong," I replied. "I'm nothing with it." Then I stepped out into the cold December night, the door closing firmly behind me. As I stood watching the snow fall, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. I had no idea where I would go. I had $342 in my checking account, a decent credit score, and a car that had seen better days. What I didn't have was my family's wealth, connections, or safety net. But I had my ideas. I had my skills. I had my determination. And for the first time, I had the chance to prove what I was truly worth, not as an Anderson, but as Alex. As I drove away, Christmas lights blurring through my tears, I made a promise to myself. This wouldn't be my ending. It would be my beginning. I just didn't know then how sweet that beginning would eventually taste, or how completely it would change everything. The first night of homelessness is something you never forget. I spent it in my car, parked in a Walmart lot, wrapped in the only blanket I'd managed to grab. January in New England is unforgiving. My breath formed small clouds as I curled up in the back seat, too numb to cry, too angry to sleep. When dawn broke, reality hit harder than the cold. I had no address, no family to call, and less than $400 to my name. My prestigious college degree suddenly seemed like a cruel joke. What good was summa cum laude when you were washing up in a gas station bathroom? One day at a time, I whispered to my reflection in the streaked mirror. Just one problem at a time. The first problem, shelter. The second, income. Everything else would have to wait. I spent that first morning in a coffee shop, nursing the cheapest drink on the menu while sending out job applications on their free Wi-Fi. By afternoon, I'd secured a room in a dilapidated boarding house on the outskirts of the city. The landlady, Mrs. Patel, took one look at my desperate face and reduced the security deposit. "First month's rent due next Friday," she said firmly, handing me a key to a room barely larger than a closet. No exceptions. That gave me exactly 10 days to find work. I walked into every business within a 3-mile radius, swallowing my pride with each door I entered. The irony wasn't lost on me. The forgotten child of Robert Anderson, one of the city's wealthiest developers, begging for minimum wage positions. On day 9, I landed 2 jobs, morning shifts at a coffee shop and evening work doing data entry for a small accounting firm. Between them, I could just cover rent and the cheapest meal plan I could devise. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Nights were for my real work. Huddled under the single flickering light in my room, I refined my business concept, coded until my fingers cramped, and built prototype after prototype of my inventory management system. When my ancient laptop finally died, I picked up a 3rd job on weekends cleaning offices just to save enough for a replacement. 6 months passed in a blur of exhaustion. Then, a breakthrough. The owner of the accounting firm, Mr. Chun, noticed the efficiency improvements I'd quietly implemented in their outdated systems. "You did this?" he asked, pointing to the streamlined database I'd created during lunch breaks. I nodded, too tired for false modesty. It was inefficient before. The next day, he offered me a full-time position with a salary that meant I could quit my other jobs. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Mr. Chen became more than an employer, he became my first believer. When I hesitantly showed him my inventory management concept, he didn't dismiss it or laugh. He studied it, asked questions, and finally looked up with genuine respect in his eyes. "This has potential, Alex. Real potential." Those 5 words changed everything. With Mr. Chen's guidance, I refined my business plan and learned the practical aspects of entrepreneurship that no college course had taught me. More importantly, he introduced me to his network of small business owners, people who immediately saw the value in what I was building. "I'll be your first client," he announced one evening after I demonstrated the beta version. "And I know at least 5 others who would pay for this yesterday." What began as survival became growth. I moved from my closet-sized room to a modest studio apartment. I traded 80-hour work weeks for focused development of what I now called Supply Line. I started sleeping again, eating proper meals, even occasionally allowing myself small luxuries like brand-name coffee. 2 years after being kicked out, I secured my first round of seed funding from an angel investor Mr. Chen introduced me to. The day the funds hit my business account, I sat alone in my apartment and finally allowed myself to cry, not from despair, but from vindication. Supply Line launched officially 3 years and 2 months after that fateful Christmas Eve. We had 12 employees, a real office, modest but with windows, and a growing client list of small to medium businesses who raved about how our software had transformed their operations. I never used the Anderson name. I never leveraged my father's connections. Every client, every dollar, every success came from my own merit. The freedom in that was indescribable. Success breeds success. By year 4, we had expanded to 3 major cities and employed over 50 people. My little survival project had become a multi-million-dollar company with growth projections that made investors salivate. I never Googled my family, never drove by the house, never checked Olivia's social media. They existed in a past I had methodically excised from my present. Until one Tuesday morning when Zoe, my VP of marketing, dropped a business magazine on my desk during our weekly meeting. "Thought you should see this," she said quietly. There on page 17 was a feature about struggling family businesses. And front and center was a photo of my father, mother, and Olivia standing in front of the Anderson Construction headquarters, their smiles strained, the building behind them noticeably less impressive than I remembered. The headline read, "Anderson Construction seeks new directions amid financial concerns." I read the article twice, my face carefully neutral. Anderson Construction, once the jewel of the regional development scene, was faltering badly. A series of poor investments, coupled with increasing competition and management challenges, had left the company on shaky ground. The final paragraph quoted my father. "We're exploring partnership opportunities. The Anderson legacy is built on adaptation and family strength. We will weather this storm." I closed the magazine and handed it back to Zoe without comment. But that night, alone in my penthouse apartment, the home I had earned through my own sweat and determination, I pulled up the company's financial records. Being public had its disadvantages for them. Their struggles were documented in quarterly reports and SEC filings. The truth was worse than the article suggested. Anderson Construction was drowning in debt, hemorrhaging clients, and months away from potential bankruptcy. My father had mortgaged everything, including the family home, to keep it afloat. 2 days later, my assistant entered my office, her face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide her discomfort. "There's an Olivia Anderson here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she insists it's urgent. Family business," she says. Family business. The irony was almost too perfect. "Send her in," I said, turning to face the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city skyline, the view I had earned, the success I had built from nothing. The door opened, and 5 years collapsed into a heartbeat as the sound of familiar footsteps crossed my office. Olivia Anderson had come back into my life. But this time, the power dynamic was unrecognizably changed. I turned slowly to face my sister. Hello, Olivia, I said calmly. Welcome to my family business. You've done well for yourself, Olivia said, her eyes scanning my office with calculated assessment. Gone was the dismissive older sister who had patted my head and called my dreams cute. In her place stood a woman trying to hide her desperation behind a veneer of familial warmth. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, but remained standing. What brings you here after 5 years of silence? She settled into the chair with practiced grace, arranging her expression into something resembling contrition. It was a good performance. I'd seen better. Alex, she began, her voice soft with manufactured emotion. I've missed you. We all have. I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. What happened that Christmas, it was wrong. Terrible. Inexcusable. She leaned forward, earnestness radiating from her like expensive perfume. I've wanted to reach out so many times, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if you'd even speak to me. And yet here you are, I observed, speaking to me. A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Yes. Because family is everything, Alex. Despite our differences, despite the past, we're still blood. I finally took my seat, studying my sister with the same analytical precision I applied to business acquisitions. 5 years of no contact, and suddenly family is everything. Interesting timing, Olivia. Her smile faltered slightly. I know how it looks. But Dad's been too proud to make the first move, and Mom, well, you know Mom. They've regretted what happened every day since. Have they? I kept my voice neutral, giving away nothing. Of course, Alex, they've followed your success from afar. They're so proud of what you've accomplished. Proud, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. That's not what I heard they were feeling when they discovered who was behind Supplyline. Olivia had the grace to look embarrassed. Dad was surprised, certainly. But beneath that, there was pride. Real pride. I let the silence stretch between us, watching as Olivia grew increasingly uncomfortable. 5 years ago, I would have filled the quiet, desperate for approval. Now, I understood the power of patience. Finally, she sighed. All right. Things aren't good at Andersen Construction. I'm sure you've read the articles. I have. It's worse than what they're reporting, she admitted. We've lost major clients to competitors. Dad made some investments that didn't pan out, and the market downturn hit us hard. I nodded, already aware of every detail she was sharing. And this concerns me how. Olivia straightened, switching tactics. You've built something extraordinary here, Alex. From nothing. It's impressive, revolutionary even. The way you've transformed how small businesses handle their supply chain is, well, it's genius. Flattery, the oldest tool in Olivia's arsenal. Dad and I have been talking, she continued, gaining momentum, about the future of Andersen Construction, about legacy, about family. And there it was. I almost smiled at the predictability. We believe there's an opportunity here for both of us. Her eyes gleamed with rehearsed enthusiasm. A merger. Andersen Construction and Supplyline. Think about it. Our established client base in development combined with your technological innovation. We could revolutionize the entire industry. I leaned back in my chair. A merger. Yes. Bringing the family business together under one unified vision, she said, warming to her pitch. The Andersen legacy, strengthened and modernized for the next generation. The family business, I repeated slowly. Exactly. Keep the business in the family where it belongs. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The audacity was almost admirable. Almost. Olivia, I said without turning around, let me make sure I understand. You want me to merge my highly successful, debt-free, rapidly growing company with your failing, debt-ridden family business, which, I remind you, never included me, to keep it in the family? Her silence was answer enough. I turned to face her. What exactly would Supplyline gain from this arrangement? She faltered for just a moment before recovering. The Andersen name has power in this city, Alex. Connections, history, respect. The name I was told not to use? The connections I was explicitly denied? The respect I had to earn entirely on my own. I kept my voice level, professional. Interesting value proposition. It's not just about business, she insisted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. It's about healing old wounds, bringing the family back together. The family that threw me out on Christmas Eve? That family? Olivia had the decency to look uncomfortable. People make mistakes, Alex. Even parents. They regret what happened every day. Enough to reach out to me themselves? To apologize directly? She shifted in her chair. You know Dad's pride. He asked me to come as a family ambassador. If you agree to discuss the merger, they'll be at the meeting. You can all reconcile then. I returned to my desk and sat down, considering her with newfound clarity. Let me be direct, Olivia. Are Mom and Dad aware that without a significant cash infusion or restructuring, Anderson Construction will face bankruptcy within the next quarter? Her carefully composed expression slipped, revealing genuine shock. How did you? Public records. Financial statements. Basic due diligence. I shrugged. The kind of research any potential business partner would do. When Olivia spoke again, her voice had lost its polished veneer. We need help, Alex. Real help. Not just financially, but your expertise. Your vision. For the first time, I glimpsed something authentic in her eyes. Everything's falling apart. The company, the house, our reputation, all of it. And so you thought of me, I said softly. The forgotten child. The one you all laughed at. Suddenly valuable when you need saving. Her eyes dropped to her hands. It wasn't always like that. You remember the good times too, did I? I searched my memory for these supposed good times and found only fragments. Moments of conditional approval quickly overshadowed by Olivia's achievements, temporary peace purchased through my silence. Here's what I'll do, I said finally. I'll consider a potential business arrangement, not a merger, an acquisition. Hope flared in her eyes. You'll help. I'll analyze the situation and determine if there's anything worth salvaging, I corrected her. I'll need complete access to all financial records, client contracts, and internal documents. I'll want to meet with executive team, including Dad. Of course. Olivia was already reaching for her phone. When can we schedule? I'm not finished, I interrupted calmly. If, and that's a significant if, I decide to move forward, it will be a complete restructuring under Supply Line's leadership. Not a partnership of equals. Are we clear? Her smile faltered. Dad might find that difficult to accept. Then he can find another solution to his problems. I stood, signaling the end of our meeting. Those are my terms, Olivia. Take them to Dad and Mom. If they're agreeable, have your CFO send over the documents I've requested, and we'll schedule a preliminary meeting. Olivia rose slowly, studying me as if seeing me for the first time. You've changed, she said quietly. No, I corrected her. I'm exactly who I've always been. You're just finally paying attention. That evening, as I reviewed the financial documents Olivia had immediately sent over, a plan began to form in my mind. Not the rescue they hoped for, but something far more elegant and final. I picked up my phone and called the one person I trusted implicitly. Mr. Chen, I need your advice on something unusual. As I outlined my thoughts, a cold certainty settled over me. The Anderson family had taught me one valuable lesson. Business was business. Nothing personal, just the bottom line. And I was about to teach them exactly how well I'd learned that lesson. The conference room on the 32nd floor offered a panoramic view of the city, but no one was admiring the scenery. My parents sat across from me, flanking Olivia like protective bookends. 5 years had carved deep lines around my father's eyes and whitened my mother's perfectly maintained hair. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by circumstance rather than time. These terms are unacceptable, my father declared, pushing the proposal away. Acquisition? Asset liquidation? Restructuring? This isn't a partnership, it's a hostile takeover. I maintained the pleasant, distant smile I'd perfected for difficult negotiations. It's a realistic assessment of Anderson Construction's market position and options, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson? My mother's voice cracked slightly. Alex, we're your parents. We're here for a business discussion. I reminded her gently. And professionally speaking, these terms are extraordinarily generous given your company's financial situation. My father's face flushed with familiar anger. Generous? You're talking about dismantling my life's work. Your life's work is dismantling itself, I corrected him. I'm offering a controlled landing rather than a crash. The CFO, a nervous man named Philip, who had worked for my father for 20 years, cleared his throat. The terms are actually quite fair, considering our position, Robert. Ms. Anderson is offering above market value for the salvageable assets. My father shot him a look of betrayal. We're not selling to a stranger, Philip. This is my child. That didn't seem to matter on Christmas Eve 5 years ago, I said, my voice still professionally pleasant. As I recall, you specifically instructed me to succeed without your name, connections, or money. I've honored that request to the letter. Silence fell heavy across the table. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, while Olivia studied me with a mixture of resentment and reluctant respect. You've made your point, Alex, she said finally. We treated you terribly. We were wrong. But this level of retribution... This isn't retribution, I interrupted. It's business. Your company is failing. Mine is thriving. I'm in a position to acquire certain assets that might be valuable to Supply Line's expansion. The fact that those assets currently belong to Anderson Construction is merely coincidental. My father's expression darkened. Nothing about this is coincidental. You're enjoying this. I met his gaze directly. What I enjoy is running a successful company. Speaking of which, I checked my watch and stood. I have another meeting. Review the proposal with your team. My offer stands for 72 hours, after which I'll need to explore other expansion opportunities. As I gathered my papers, my mother reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of mine. Alex, please. Can't we discuss this as a family? We are discussing it exactly as this family has always operated, I replied. Business first, with clear winners and losers. I'm simply playing by the rules I was raised with. I left them sitting in the conference room, their reflections in the glass wall growing smaller as I walked away. My assistant fell into step beside me as we headed toward the elevator. The documentation for the proxy purchases has been prepared, she murmured. Mr. Chen's associates are ready to move forward on your signal. Good. Begin phase 1 immediately. The elevator doors closed, sealing us in polished silence. And Maya? Make sure all transactions are untraceable. Always, Ms. Anderson. When I returned to my office, I found a message waiting for my mother, a rambling voicemail full of tearful reminiscences and pleas for family reconciliation. I deleted it without a second thought and turned my attention to executing the real plan, the one I hadn't shared in that conference room. The proposal I'd presented to my family was merely a distraction. While they agonized over whether to accept my harsh terms, I had already set in motion a series of proxy acquisitions targeting Anderson Construction's remaining valuable assets. Small companies that appeared unrelated to Supply Line were quietly purchasing shares, property rights, and outstanding loans. By the time my family realized what was happening, I would control everything they valued without their knowledge or consent. They'll be suspicious if we move too quickly, Mr. Chen had warned when I first outlined my strategy. They won't, I'd assured him. They see only what they expect to see. And they expect me to be direct, confrontational, and emotional, just as I've always been with them. They'd never suspect this level of calculation. I was right. 3 days later, my father called to request an extension on the proposal review. We need more time to consider alternatives, he said stiffly. Of course, I agreed with carefully measured reluctance. I can give you another week, but I should warn you, I'm exploring other options as well. We understand. His voice softened slightly. And Alex, your mother would like to meet with you. Just the two of you. For coffee or something. No business talk. I paused, allowing him to interpret my silence as hesitation rather than calculation. I'll consider it, I finally replied. Have her contact my assistant. The meeting with my mother was a strategic necessity. Over expensive coffee in a neutral location, she alternated between tearful reminiscence and awkward attempts at maternal connection. "You've done so well," she said, her eyes scanning my tailored suit and subtle jewelry. "You always were independent." "Not by choice," I reminded her gently. She had the grace to flinch. "We made terrible mistakes, Alex. Your father especially, but I was just as guilty. We took Olivia's side without question, dismissed your potential, and then, that awful Christmas." "Yes," I agreed. "That awful Christmas. If we could go back." "We can't," I interrupted. "The past is immutable. We can only move forward. As a family?" Hope edged into her voice. I reached across the table and took her hand, the first physical contact I'd initiated with any family member since my return. "I'm trying to find a path forward that works for everyone," I lied smoothly. She left our meeting heartened, carrying messages of cautious optimism back to my father and Olivia. Meanwhile, phase 2 of my plan accelerated. By week's end, proxy companies controlled by Mr. Chen's network had acquired 22% of Andersen Construction's outstanding shares and held the notes on 3 of their largest loans. My family, distracted by the possibility of reconciliation, noticed nothing. 2 weeks into negotiations, I invited them to another meeting, this time at my penthouse. The gesture was calculated to seem personal, a step toward family reconnection. "I've been reconsidering aspects of the proposal," I told them as we sat in my living room overlooking the city. "Perhaps there's a way to preserve more of the Andersen Construction legacy than initially outlined." The relief on their faces was palpable. "I knew you'd come around," my father said, the familiar condescension creeping back into his voice. "Blood is thicker than water, after all." I smiled, thinking of the documents waiting in my safe, evidence of ownership they didn't yet know existed. "Indeed it is," I agreed. "Family is everything." Olivia reached for my hand, her smile genuine for perhaps the first time in our adult relationship. "This means so much, Alex. To all of us." I squeezed her fingers gently, the perfect picture of reconciliation. "We'll finalize everything next week. One meeting to put the past behind us and move forward together." That night, alone in my penthouse, I received confirmation of the final acquisitions. Through various proxies, I now controlled 67% of Andersen Construction's assets, including their headquarters building, which my father had mortgaged to cover operating expenses. I opened a bottle of champagne and stood at my window, gazing out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the house I'd been thrown out of, the family that had discarded me, and the legacy they thought was still theirs to control. "One more week," I whispered to my reflection in the glass. "One more meeting." The Andersen Construction headquarters had seen better days. The once immaculate lobby now showed subtle signs of decline, plants slightly less lush, furniture a touch worn, staff noticeably reduced. I passed through security with my small team, nodding at employees who glanced curiously at the supply line logo on our visitors' badges. "Top floor," I instructed as we entered the elevator. The main boardroom. My father had insisted on hosting our final negotiation on his territory, a last grasp at control I'd allowed him to believe he had. The irony wasn't lost on me. This building, like everything else bearing the Andersen name, was already mine. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it: intimidating mahogany table, oversized leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city skyline. My father had conducted countless power plays in this room. Today would be his last. They were waiting for me, my father at the head of the table, my mother to his right, Olivia to his left, flanked by their executive team and legal counsel. Their expressions brightened when they saw me enter alone. "Where's your team?" my father asked, clearly pleased by what he perceived as a weakness. "They'll join us shortly," I replied, taking a seat directly opposite him. I wanted a moment with just family first. My mother smiled warmly. "That's thoughtful, Alex. We've been looking forward to finalizing this arrangement." "As have I," I said, returning her smile with practiced ease. "I believe today marks a new chapter for all of us." My father nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. I've reviewed your revised proposal. It's acceptable, with some minor adjustments, of course. Of course, I echoed, glancing at my watch. But before we get into details, I'd like to address the elephant in the room, our past. A flicker of discomfort crossed their faces. Olivia shifted in her chair. Alex, we've discussed this, she said gently. We all made mistakes. We're moving forward now, together. Yes, I agreed, moving forward. But first, I'd like to hear it directly. From all of you, an acknowledgement of what happened. My father frowned. Is this really necessary? We're here to discuss business. Indulge me, I said softly. Just this once. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The executives exchanged glances, clearly wondering what family drama they had stumbled into. Finally, my mother spoke.
We were wrong, Alex.
Terribly wrong. The way we treated you, dismissing your ideas, favoring Olivia, and especially that Christmas Eve. Her voice wavered. There's no excuse. We failed you as parents. I nodded, my expression neutral. And you, Dad? My father's jaw clenched. Apologizing had never been his strong suit. I made a mistake, he said stiffly. I was harsh. Unfair. I should have seen your potential. And you, Olivia? My sister met my gaze directly. I was jealous, she admitted, surprising me with her candor. You were always the smart one, the innovative one. I took credit for your work because I knew I couldn't match it. I'm sorry, Alex. Truly. I let their words hang in the air for a moment, savoring them not for the satisfaction they brought, but for the record they established. Then I nodded to my assistant, who had just entered the room. Perfect timing, I said as Maya placed a folder in front of me. Now we can begin. Excellent, my father said, visibly relieved to move past the emotional interchange. Our attorneys have prepared. Actually, I interrupted. I have something to share first. I opened the folder and slid a document across the table. This might interest you. My father glanced at the paper, his brow furrowing. What is this? Ownership documentation, I replied calmly. For Anderson Tower. This building. He looked up sharply. What are you talking about? I own this building. Not anymore, I said, sliding another document forward. And not just the building. Here's documentation for your development projects on the west side, and the riverfront property, and the commercial complex downtown. One by one, I placed documents on the table, watching as comprehension slowly dawned on their faces. This isn't possible, my father muttered, frantically scanning the papers. These are forgeries. They're quite real, I assured him. As are these, I nodded to Maya, who distributed another round of documents, showing ownership transfer of 67% of Anderson Construction's total assets to various entities that, as of this morning, are wholly owned subsidiaries of Supplyline. The room erupted in chaos. The executives scrambled for their phones, the lawyers huddled together in urgent whispers, and my father rose from his chair, his face contorted with rage. What have you done? He demanded, his voice a dangerous growl. I remained seated, calm amidst the storm. Business, I replied simply. Just business. This is theft, he shouted. Actually, it's perfectly legal acquisition through the open market, I corrected him. Your company is publicly traded, your assets were leveraged as collateral for loans you couldn't repay, and your shareholders were more than happy to sell to my proxy buyers at premium prices. My mother had gone pale, her hands trembling as she looked through the documentation. Alex, why, she whispered. You said we were moving forward together. We are, I confirmed, just not in the way you imagined. I stood now, commanding the room with the quiet authority I developed over years of building my own empire. Anderson Construction, as you know it, no longer exists, I announced. Its assets, contracts, and remaining value now belong to Supplyline. The Anderson family home, which you mortgaged to cover operating costs, is also now my property. Olivia stared at me in disbelief. You've been planning this all along, she realized. The meetings, the negotiations, the reconciliation, it was all a distraction. I learned from the best. I replied with a slight nod toward my father. Isn't that what you taught me? Identify weakness, create leverage, and strike when they least expect it. The executive team began filing out, recognizing that their careers at Andersen Construction had just ended. Only my family remained, shell-shocked and speechless. You have until the end of the month to vacate the family home, I said, gathering my documents. Your personal effects will be respected, but everything else stays. As for your positions here, they're terminated, effective immediately. You can't do this, my father said, but the fight had drained from his voice, replaced by dawning horror. I already have, I replied simply. Security will escort you out. Your access cards have been deactivated. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and one last thing. Merry Christmas. 6 months after that fateful boardroom confrontation, I stood on the balcony of my new office, formerly my father's, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of amber and gold. The Andersen Construction logo had been replaced with Supply Line's sleek, modern emblem. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that began in a tiny boarding house room had now consumed the empire that had once seemed unassailable. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Olivia Andersen spotted at the Edison Hotel bar. 3rd night this week. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without responding. I didn't need surveillance reports to know how my family was faring. The business pages and social media told the story clearly enough. The fall of the mighty Andersens had become something of a cautionary tale in business circles. My father, once the titan of regional development, was now reduced to consulting for former competitors who hired him more for the schadenfreude than his expertise. My mother had retreated from her social circles, unable to face the humiliation of financial ruin. And Olivia, golden, perfect Olivia, had perhaps fallen furthest of all. Last week, I'd received an email from her. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a resume attached with a terse note. I need work. Any position. I'd forwarded it to HR with instructions to treat it like any other application. It was rejected within hours. Insufficient qualifications for available positions. The truth was, Olivia had spent her life trading on the Andersen name and connections, never developing the skills or work ethic required to stand on her own. Now she spent her evenings at hotel bars, hoping to network her way back to relevance, clinging to the remnants of her former status with increasingly desperate dignity. Ms. Andersen? Maya's voice pulled me back to the present. The quarterly projections are ready for your review, and Mr. Chen is waiting for you in the conference room. I nodded, turning away from the view. Thank you, Maya. I'll be right there. Mr. Chen had become my most trusted advisor and friend through this journey. When I'd explained my complete plan to him all those months ago, he'd asked only one question. Is this revenge what you truly want, or is it what you think you need? I hadn't had an answer then. I still wasn't sure I did. The conference room was bustling with energy when I arrived, my executive team discussing strategies, reviewing data, planning our next expansion. These were people who respected me for my mind, my vision, my leadership, not for my family name or connections. The contrast with my father's old boardroom meetings couldn't have been more stark. Alex. Mr. Chen greeted me warmly. We've got something special to celebrate today. On the screen behind him flashed our latest financial results, a 42% increase in revenue, expansion to 2 new markets, and client retention numbers that defied industry standards. The Supply Line system has been nominated for the National Innovation Award, Maya announced, handing me a formal invitation to the gala ceremony. You're the youngest CEO ever to be considered. The team erupted in applause. I smiled, genuine pride warming my chest. This success was earned through actual merit, not manipulation or nepotism. Every person in this room knew the value of what we'd built together. After the meeting concluded, Mr. Chen lingered behind. I saw them yesterday, he said quietly. Your parents, at Carlyle's diner on 5th. I raised an eyebrow. Carlyle's? That's unexpected. The Greasy Spoon was a far cry from the Michelin-starred establishments my parents had frequented in their heyday. They looked older, Mr. Chen continued. Your father especially. They were sharing a single entree. I said nothing, but something twisted uncomfortably in my chest. Revenge is a curious thing, Mr. Chen mused. It promises satisfaction, but rarely delivers it. Tell me, Alex, has it been worth it? I considered the question carefully. It wasn't just about revenge, I finally replied. It was about justice. Balance. They needed to understand what they'd done. And do they understand now? I thought about my father's face as security had escorted him from the building he'd once dominated. About my mother's trembling hands as she'd packed her designer clothes into cardboard boxes. About Olivia drinking alone at hotel bars, her golden future tarnished beyond repair. Yes, I said. I believe they do. Then perhaps it's time for you to understand something as well, Mr. Chen said gently. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. As long as you track their downfall, you remain as bound to them as they once were to their own ambitions. That night, I sat alone in my penthouse, Mr. Chen's words echoing in my thoughts. On my coffee table lay the folder Maya had compiled, addresses, finances, daily routines of the 3 people who had shaped and then shattered my early life. My father had taken a small apartment across town. My mother had moved in with her sister in the suburbs. Olivia was couch surfing between increasingly less patient friends. They were living a life I had been thrust into that Christmas Eve, uncertain, precarious, humbled. With sudden clarity, I realized I no longer needed to know these details. Their struggles, while poetic in their justice, were no longer my concern. The most complete revenge wasn't watching their downfall. It was no longer caring enough to watch it all. I closed the folder and dropped it into the shredder. The next morning, I called my legal team. Draw up new incorporation papers for our latest acquisition, I instructed. Rename it from Anderson Construction to Supply Line Development Division. Remove any trace of the Anderson name. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't sure I'd ever reach that point. But it was freedom. Freedom from the past, from the need for vindication, from the Anderson legacy that had defined me for too long, both in its rejection and in my rebellion against it. 5 years ago, standing in that snowy driveway with nothing but a duffel bag and broken dreams, I thought my story was about proving my worth to a family that couldn't see it. Now I understood that it had never been about them at all. It was about becoming who I was always meant to be, not as a reaction to their cruelty or validation of their regret, but as the person I'd built through resilience, innovation, and determination. My empire wasn't my greatest achievement. My freedom was.